In this section of the lecture, I'll be talking about the Japanese economy from the period after World War II through to about 1990. In the previous section of the lecture, we saw how in the 70 years from 1870 to 1940, the Japanese economy had made huge strides towards becoming a developed economy. World War II interrupted that trajectory of development. World War II had similar effects on the Japanese economy as it did on the European economies. For example, there was massive destruction of physical infrastructure and capital. There was a huge loss of life and reduction in human capital available to the economy. And there was the major disruption of diverting productive resources to wartime activity and then back to regular economic activity in the period after the war. This graph shows what happened to GDP per capita in Japan in the lead up to and during and just after the war. And you can see how in the period from around about 1943 to 1947, there's a very substantial, about a 50% decrease in GDP per capita in Japan before growth in GDP per capita resumes. In this graph, you can see how in the lead up to the war and during the war, relatively slow growth in population, mainland Japanese population actually decreasing in the latter period of the war before resuming an upward trajectory. Some of that upward trajectory due to return of Japanese citizens from what had been Japanese colonies to the Japanese mainland. After World War II, economic growth in Japan was to resume. In fact, at an even more rapid rate than had been occurring before World War II. And in the next part of this section of the lecture, I'm going to give an overview of Japan's experience of growth in this period after World War II. So first of all, during this period, Japan had economic growth that was rapid in comparison to other countries and rapid in comparison to historical precedents. The growth was exceptionally strong from 1945 to around 1973, slower but still above that in other developed countries from 1973 through to 1990. It was a period where the Japanese economy grew because economic development was accorded a major priority in Japanese society. And this is a period when Japan becomes like the West in terms of becoming a consumer society. So for example, by 1970, very quickly sort of after World War II, 90% of households in Japan have a TV, washing machine and refrigerator. This table gives some data on the average annual rate of growth in GDP per capita for Japan, the US and West Germany, which I've chosen as a benchmark Western European country. And you can see the point that first of all from 45 to 73, Japan is growing well in excess of the rate in the US and even in excess of that of a country which has a very strong growth experience in Europe with scope for catch-up and convergence after World War II. From 1973 to 1990, you can see the growth rate is lower in Japan, but it still remains above that in the US and West Germany. From 1990 to 2010, which is a period we'll take up in a later section of this lecture, you can see Japanese growth in GDP per capita has been much slower, and in fact in that period has fallen behind the US. This is a different way of showing how rapid and remarkable the Japanese growth experience was in the period after World War II. So it's a graph that runs from 1950 to 1990, and on the horizontal axis is years behind the US in GDP per capita. So what I've done is I've looked at Japanese GDP per capita in a particular year, such as 1950, and then I've asked how many years before that did the United States have that same level of GDP per capita. And so you can see that, wow, in 1950, Japan was about 100 years behind the United States. That is, it was about 100 years before 1950 that the United States had the level of GDP per capita that Japan attained in 1950. But then, as we move forward in time, we see Japan catching up to the United States, so that by 1990, the level of GDP per capita that Japan has attained then, that was a level that the US was only attaining about 8 or 9 years before. So that Japan had gone from being, in the space of 40 years, has gone from being 100 years behind the United States to only being 8 or 9 years behind the United States. The Japanese story of economic development was the story of it continuing to become an industrialised economy. And one aspect of that story was how what sectors of industry, manufacturing industry, Japan was operating in evolved over time. This table shows the share of Japanese manufacturing exports in different areas of manufacturing industry in 1955 and 1978. And so you can see in 1955, the Japanese manufacturing industry was still to quite a large degree focused on at the what we might think of as the more basic end of manufacturing, so textiles production. But Japan had started to get into metals and metal products and machinery and vehicles. By the late 1970s, textiles is no longer a very important part of manufacturing industry in Japan. Instead, Japan's become a major producer of machinery and vehicles. So it's moved up the manufacturing ladder in terms of the complexity of products that it's producing. That evolution then continues from the 1970s to the 1980s and 1990s, where Japan goes from being a major manufacturer of, for example, machinery, transport equipment, to being a world leader in the electronics and computer industries. This table, which has a lot of data in it, is an attempt to give you a perspective on what the sources of Japanese growth were during this period after World War II. So there's a series of measures or variables which I've got down the left-hand side here, and for each of those I've got two observations in 1950 and 1970, and I'm comparing Japan against some of the other major industrial developed economies in the world. And you can see if you compare gross national product per capita in 1952 and 1972, you can see that the multiple by which Japan grows is much greater than in any of these other economies, making the point again that Japan had a very rapid rate of growth during this period, which had allowed it to really substantially catch up to many of these other developed countries by the 1970s. The next variable is investment as a share of gross national product. And if you look across in 1952, you see that one thing that's notable in Japan is that it has a relatively high share or amount of investment, a relatively high share of investment in gross national product. And in fact, when we look forward to 1971, we see that increases. It increases in some of these other countries as well, but the fact that it increases in Japan means that Japan really remains the leader in terms of the amount of investment that it's doing. And so one big reason that Japan catches up and converges to these other developed economies during this period is that Japan is really devoting a lot of its national resources to investing in, for example, capital equipment that can become the basis of having a manufacturing industry. If we look at government spending as a share of GNP, you notice that Japan in 1952, it's actually at the bottom end of government spending, and it remains that way in 1971, even though there's a small increase in government current spending. And that tells us that Japan's economic development, if anything, was associated with the government trying to remain small in the economy in terms of its share of economic activity to free up resources for private sector activity. The next variable that's there is exports plus imports as a share of GDP. And you can see that Japan, 27% in 1950, 21% in 1971, that's not especially high compared to a lot of the countries in Europe. The United States is a very large economy, that would explain it having a smaller involvement with international trade. But the point here is that Japan's economic development doesn't seem to have been especially driven by having a large share of its economic activity involved with international trade, or having a large increase in that in the period when it was developing most strongly. Nevertheless, because the Japanese economy grows, even keeping the same amount of involvement in trade means that the Japanese economy becomes a much more important part of world trade from the early 1950s to the early 1970s. The final thing in this table is the percentage of the workforce in agriculture. And here we see another major driver of Japanese economic development during this period. That in the early 1950s, Japan still has a much larger proportion of its workforce in agriculture than other developed economies. And so Japan is able to achieve much larger increases in productivity by transferring workers from agriculture to industry than is able to be done in other developed economies in Europe, even though, as we've talked about previously, that's also a major driver of economic development in those European economies, well, in particular, say, Germany, France and Italy in this table. So it's a driver of growth in those economies, but it's if you like, a super driver of growth in the Japanese economy. What I'm going to do now is talk a little bit more about some separate phases of growth during this period after World War II in Japan, starting out with the immediate post-war period. So in the immediate post-war period, Japanese economic growth is powered by the forces of catch-up and convergence that we've talked about previously, that Japan is able to bounce back after the disruption to its previous growth path, potentially after the disruption of the war, and it's able to do that by taking new technology from the US and Europe. Japan is occupied by the US until April 18th, 1952, a period that's been described by Hugh Patrick and Henry Rozovsky as perhaps one of the most ambitious attempts at social engineering the world has seen. And so the US during this period implements a set of reforms which are regarded as laying a foundation for the economic growth which is to come. So parliamentary democracy is introduced, land reforms are introduced to give tenants who'd been farming land ownership of their land. The zaibatsu industrial conglomerates are abolished to try and increase or create a more competitive market economy. A similar principle really, I guess, underlying that to when we talked about the Marshall Plan. In implementing the Marshall Plan, the United States was emphasised trying to increase the role of market activity in the European countries that it funded. And it has a similar philosophy with Japan. The other thing that happens in Japan is that Japan is limited in its ability to spend on military expenditure, and so that really gives it, and its military, what would have otherwise been its military expenditure, is taken up by the US, and that really gives sort of a dividend to Japan, which then has extra resources to spend on private sector economic activity that might otherwise have needed to be spent on military capability. The other factor that's important in the immediate post-war period is the Korean War. And so Japan becomes a major supplier to the US military during the Korean War, which gives an initial boost to its manufacturing industry. In the 1950s to the 1970s, there's two key drivers of the rapid rate of growth in the Japanese economy. One is the shift of economic activity from agriculture to industry, and the fact that in Japan there was a very large difference in labour productivity between those sectors. So if you say have a worker in agriculture and a worker in industry and they're equally productive, and you shift a worker from agriculture to industry, then it's not going to have any effect on the aggregate level of productivity in the economy because the worker was equally productive in both sectors. But if you have a situation where workers in agriculture aren't very productive and workers in industry are very productive, and we take a worker from agriculture and put that worker into industry, then we've added to the aggregate average level of productivity in the economy. And the bigger that gap is, the bigger the boost to productivity we're going to get from shifting the worker from agriculture to industry. And so Japan's an economy where there's still a significant scope to shift workers from agriculture to industry, and where there really is a large difference in labour productivity between the sectors, which means there's going to be a big boost to aggregate productivity when we shift workers between the sectors. The other element is a high rate of growth in labour productivity in manufacturing that comes via capital accumulation, bringing in new technologies, and exploiting economies of scale from becoming a large-scale producer. This table just tells you, or gives you a little bit of a perspective on the differences in productivity between agriculture and manufacturing. You can see that in 1956, basically 4 workers in 10 in Japan were employed in agriculture, yet they only accounted for about 1/10 of the value of output that was produced in the Japanese economy. Whereas if we look at manufacturing, it was accounting for about 15%, yet it was of the labour force, yet it was accounting for about 30% of output. So you can see a huge difference in the relative productivity of workers in agriculture and manufacturing. That means that when we take a worker from agriculture and put them into manufacturing, that the value that they contribute to GDP in the economy is going to be substantially increased. Now, by 1971, you've had a big shift of workers out of agriculture and into industry. And so that's going to have boosted productivity. And you see that sort of differential in the relative productivity with labour force relative to GDP still exists in 1971, which meant that even in 1971 there was still more scope to keep getting a boost to productivity in that way. On this slide, I've listed sort of a variety of underpinning factors which you can think of as predisposing the Japanese economy towards being an economy that could grow rapidly, or facilitated that growth. One was that Japan had a highly educated workforce. So even at the beginning of this period, the average years of education in Japan, about 8 years, was similar to Europe, and only a couple of years behind that in the United States. And Japan would emphasise increasing educational attainment during this period. Japan had a very high domestic savings rate, so it was able to finance new capital investment without relying on what could sometimes be the unstable source of international borrowing. Japan's demography during this period assisted it in growing. There was high population growth and a relatively high proportion of the population in the workforce age. So growing proportion of population in workforce age means you've got a relatively larger share of the population contributing to GDP, which, other things equal, is going to increase your GDP per capita. Government during this period, as we saw in previous slide, government wasn't a large part of economic activity, and that seems to have been a deliberate strategy of trying to keep government small to make resources available for the private sector. So as this quote from Allen suggests, that the government's chief contribution after the war was the creation of conditions congenial to the exercise of industrial enterprise. Now, the fact that government was a small part of GDP doesn't mean that it didn't play or seek to play a role in the development of the economy. And in fact, it did, but more through trying to direct the areas where economic activity in Japan would proceed in this period and would develop most. Institutions are another underpinning factor during this period. There was sort of variety of distinctive aspects of the organisation of industry and employment in Japan. So models of lifetime employment created low rates of turnover for Japanese firms, gave them the incentive to invest in firm-specific human capital in their workforces. There were the keiretsu, which were new types of linked arrangements between firms. So there were intermarket keiretsu, which were composed of, say, 20 to 40 large firms, including manufacturing companies, banks and insurance firms. And there were also vertical sort of keiretsu composed of large industrial suppliers and subsidiaries. And these keiretsu had the objective of trying to reduce transactions costs that might have otherwise existed for these companies in dealing with each other, to reduce the costs of trade. There's also sort of, especially in, say, the 1980s, a lot of attention to distinctive Japanese, sometimes called Toyotism, model of production. Things like just-in-time production and improvement systems, which were often seen as an important part of Japan becoming a high productivity manufacturing economy, especially amongst larger firms. After 1973, Japanese growth, still, as we saw at the start of this section of the lecture, occurring at a relatively rapid rate compared to other parts of the world. But remember that after 1973, this is when growth in the rest of the world is slowing, and so it slows in Japan as well. Partly that seems to be to do with similar sort of force that was affecting the rest of the developed world, especially Europe, during this period, the end of catch-up and convergence. So Japan, by the 1970s, is converging towards the technological industrial lead of the United States. So there's just not the same extent to which it can grow rapidly by taking technologies that have been developed in Europe and the US and applying them in Japan. The oil price shock in the early 1970s, that also disrupts economic growth in Japan. Japan is a producer of many energy-intensive type industrial products, and so the higher price of energy disrupts its production of those products. There's increasing competition from other Asian economies, and also perhaps a similar idea that we saw for Europe, what I've called here the Eikengren type argument, that the institutions in Japan that were suited to the rapid development of an industrial manufacturing economy, for example, a keiretsu, weren't so well suited to the organisational needs of achieving productivity improvement in the service sector, which was increasingly becoming an important part of the Japanese economy from the 1970s onwards. This table just gives a bit of a numerical perspective on this idea of the end of convergence in Japan, and it has two periods, 1953 to 73, which is the period we saw of most rapid growth, and 73 to 91. And you can see how, I talked about before, how capital accumulation, the high rate of capital accumulation via investment activity was a major driver of economic growth in Japan. And in the period after 1973, that rate of investment is slowing. The demographic boost from population growth is slowing. Education, the growth in education attainment continues to be a force that is positive for Japanese economic growth in the period from the 1970s, with actually a pretty much equal improvement in the years of average years of education in both those periods. The other thing we see is that in this period of 1973 to 91, another aspect of sort of the catch-up and convergence, there's just less scope for Japan to get an improvement in productivity and economic growth by transferring workers from agriculture to industry. So in 1953 to 73, we see that the percentage of workers in agriculture is reduced by about 25%. So 25% of the Japanese workforce has gone from jobs in agriculture out of agriculture, and a large proportion of that has gone into industry. But the scope for that to happen diminishes as we shift more and more workers from agriculture to industry. And so you can see that in 1973 to 91, the shift from workers from agriculture is much smaller, and in fact the proportion of workers in manufacturing industry declined slightly over that period. So a variety of forces that were major influences on Japanese economic development from 53 to 73 might still exist, but a lot less strongly in the period from 73 to 91. Investment, capital accumulation, demographic effects, and the benefit of shifting workers from agriculture to industry. In the next section of this lecture, I'll move on to talk about a group of other Asian economies known as the high-performing Asian economies. Those are countries which also, like Japan, experienced rapid economic growth in the period after World War II.